My thanks to mpb.com for sponsoring our podcasts, the website to go to if you want to buy, trade or sell quality used kit online in the UK, Europe and in the States. On the day of this particular edition's release, it's Monday, September the 11th, 2023. This is a programme I planned to present last year, though 12 months have passed, meaning I have an additional voice to help tell a photographic story of 9/11. Our commemoration for an event that has shaped history, a day that was felt in every corner of the world for a myriad of social, political and other reasons. Three voices with my own commentary too, as I personally recall the decisions I made that day as programme boss at a radio company. We're joined by street photographer Phil Penman, photojournalist Jason Florio, and celebrated documentarian and street photographer Joel Meyerowitz, who shares his thoughts of what happened after. The following story has audio and language that some listeners may find disturbing.
We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that.
I was waiting at a table and I literally saw it seemed to be like a small plane.
If that building was in fact crowded with workers, we're looking at probably some casualties and injuries of considerable proportions.
Then all of a sudden, stuff just started falling, like bricks and paper and everything.
A major explosion from probably, looks like about the 80th floor. It looks like it's affected probably 4 to 8 floors.
We can't see a second plane in the picture. There we see the explosion.
American 11, are you trying to call?
Nobody moved. Everything was okay.
Another one just hit the building. Wow.
It was lunchtime in the UK on Tuesday, the 11th of September 2001, sometime between 12:46 and 1:03 p.m. And I know that because when I first saw it was a long filmed shot of the financial district in Lower Manhattan. I recall only one of the towers burning. And I was working as a program director for a radio channels company that effectively meant we produced radio material for household commercial names, and there was a live network for News International. And it's odd the things that you particularly remember. I do remember where the television was when I first saw those pictures, where it was situated in the office. And I remember David, one of our news presenters, who came to get me from the production studio, and he said only a handful of words to the effect of something really bad has happened to the World Trade Center. And he turned on his feet and he headed straight back to the newsroom. And when I appeared, everyone, save those on air, the presenters on air, everyone was in that room, watching a television that was high on a bookcase that had it had lever arch files, and I think they were, from memory, I'm sure they were the accounts lever arch files. Everybody was making early guesses of what could possibly have happened and how a plane could make that sort of mistake as the news was coming out. And then the live feed showed something far more sinister unfolding, 18 minutes after the first strike, and then it was no longer pilot error. That much was clear, but nothing else was very clear, though. And the managing director turned to me and he said, well, why don't we simply take the Sky News feed? And I felt on that particular day, and with what I was seeing before my eyes, that we had enough qualified and experienced broadcasters that we could trust their judgment to navigate opt-ins to news where we needed, but discuss their view and their human reaction, which was also being supported by a growing number of phone calls. The The radio stations that I looked after, they weren't terrestrial radio stations. They didn't broadcast over FM. They were these bespoke individual channels that were purchased by large organisations and commerce networks. Networks, I suppose, like HSBC would have been one of them. And as I say, News International. So the commercial radio rules, well, they didn't really apply to us. There was no handbook of suggestions on what to do next. So we pooled the stations, we stripped them of their individual brands, and we joined all six, I think it was six, together as one single channel. And the first call I made that day was to the only contact I managed to connect with in the States, in New York, since comms were severely disrupted for obvious reasons. He was a seasoned yellow cab driver who shared stories weekly with us about what happened on the streets of New York City. Somehow, we managed to maintain a line with him for most of the day. I suspect he was speaking to us on a landline, and he really did speak from the heart about the city he loved as he got word from his colleagues across the island. Now, it's surely difficult to appreciate the real enormity of something happening nearly 3,500 miles away, and this seemed truly impossible, what we were watching, that growing feeling of some kind of Armageddon. I mean, it truly was a word I heard mooted by that taxi driver. Sadly, his name I can no longer remember, and I did look to see, because I do have audio from many years going back. I didn't have any from that particular period. But I personally went through a gamut of emotions as I just sat and, I'll be honest, proudly listened to my team, some of whom struggled to keep it to professional observation. In fact, really, I cared not one jot that they could sometimes just sit and go absolutely quiet, in silence. I would imagine in personal thought when it all became too much. One particular presenter sat in silence for what seemed to me to be up to a minute or two at a time, just watching the TV monitors and trying to formulate what she might say next. After our day was done, I went to the pub next door, which was it was a sort of pub come terrible kitchen come loud music bar. It was usually the perfect place to decompress for employees of a town practically owned by one of our largest mobile phone operators in the UK. But usually this pub would be a hive of activity and really, really noisy. There were a lot of people in there, but it was completely hushed, except for the TVs in all four corners of the rectangular ground floor. Meanwhile, over in New York, a youthful photojournalist who I was to get to know, was making his first impressions on the business. He'd just arrived back from a country just days earlier, a country that was about to make headlines in a most unimaginable way. Jason Florio is his name. He has since become a friend, and though you'll have heard this clip some 3 years ago, it's where I pick up the story today through the eyes of those who were there that day.
So I was making a second journey into Afghanistan in 2001. In 2000, I'd travelled across Afghanistan to get a look at what the Taliban were up to, and my intentions were to head up into the north to be with Amir Shah Massoud, who was one of the big anti-Taliban commanders. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it in 2000, but a year later, the invitation was left open, and I was able to get up to see Massoud. Spent about a month up in the Panjshir Valley, where he was holed up against the Taliban. Spent pretty much all of August up there with him and his sort of crew of fighters. And I returned to New York right at the beginning of September, about September the 5th, and I went to show all my pictures to the agency, and they said, yeah, it looks really great. No, I couldn't sell them. No one was interested in Afghan pictures, and I was just really disgruntled. September the 11th happened, and I live in Greenwich Village, and I was actually at a friend's house when I got the phone call from my agent and said, look, something's happened at the Twin Towers.
You didn't hear anything?
Actually, I should go back. I did actually hear a plane go. I think, well, that was really low. Didn't really think too much about it. The phone rang, and it was my agent. He said, something's happened at the World Trade Center. I know you live close by. Do you think you can get down there? So I ran back to my apartment to get my gear. I had an Italian photographer friend staying there. He grabbed his stuff, and we started sort of going against the tide of people. We could see the towers were burning, and I ended up getting to the foot of the towers. My friend I was running with actually was wearing a pair of flip-flops. He said, I'm going to go back and get properly equipped, kind of thing. So I said, okay, I'll meet you later. I'm sure it's just probably a small plane or something's happened. It's not going to be a big deal. I got to the foot of the towers, and I was with a bunch of policemen and some firemen, and we're just looking at these things burning, and I was sort of trying to compose pictures as best as possible. And the fireman said, there's bits of debris are starting to come down. I think we should pull back a little bit. And instead of pulling away north, we just basically turned to the right onto Vesey Street, and just as we took a few steps, I heard this massive explosion, and I looked around and thought, there must have been, by that point we did know the big planes had hit, but we thought, maybe there was another bomb in the building, and that's what's exploded. Didn't realize the tower was coming down. Anyway, I started sprinting up the block. I put the camera behind me and just fired off about 4 very wobbly frames of dust and debris. And it felt like I was running in slow motion. It was the strangest sensation. And I realized when I went back later on that street has a small incline to it. So it did sort of feel I was sort of fighting this sort of movement. I got up to the corner, which was just maybe about 100 feet away, and there's a small entrance to the World Trade Center subway station. And I just literally went down the stairs because the dust had caught up with me by that point, and I just went tumbling down the stairs. Ended up at the bottom of the stairs, and I had a Contax G2 camera with me and a Canon EOS, all film cameras obviously back then. And I realized the viewfinder had got smashed on my G2, and I was more concerned about the equipment. And then I realized I couldn't actually breathe because so much dust had gone in there. And I started to sort of have a minor panic attack, I would say, because I was like, oh my God, I've got too close. I'm not going to get out of here. And then I heard some voices, and so I had this visualization that I would be able to get onto the tracks, and with these other people, we'd be able to walk up the subway tunnel. The people I was with were actually ended up being police officers, and they had kind of some sort of vests on. So I remember I sort of held on to them, and we sort of started to make our way through this tunnel, but we popped up on the other side of the street on Broadway, and it was just this insane scene. It was just, the air was filled with the dust. It was something that stayed in the air in New York for a good 2 or 3 weeks. It was this very acrid, burning smell, and sometimes there's things that remind me of that, and I'm immediately taken back to that moment. But at that point, I remember just trying to breathe. I'd got all this dust in my throat, and there was an ambulance that was parked there, and I remember trying to open the door of the ambulance. I thought, well, I can get in there and get a bit of air. But some firemen caught up with us, and they took us to, there was a small deli. It's called the Stage Door Deli. It's just about a block away from the World Trade Center. And in there was a load of policemen, there were some firemen. Everyone was just completely covered in white dust. There was Ruth Frempson. She was a big New York Times photographer, and she actually won a Pulitzer Prize for the photograph that she took inside of the deli there. So I sort of stayed in there for, I think, about 20 minutes, just trying to drink water and kind of get all this dust out. And it was just a very sort of strange scene. I don't remember the sound. It felt very quiet. I'm sure there was sirens and things, but it's almost I lived that moment back through the pictures, and obviously the pictures are silent. And I think got about 20 minutes into it, and I thought, you know what, I can't sit around in here. I need to get out and see what's going on. So I got out onto the street, and I saw a uniformed woman. I didn't think what department she was from, but she was with an officer who was down on the ground, I didn't know at that point, but he was really badly injured. He got his arm almost severed. And she was trying to help him. Other people were coming around. And I started taking pictures of this officer. And years later, we sort of reconnected. We had two very different points of view of what happened at that moment. I'm sure she said to me, what are you doing? Have you got nothing else better to do? And I said, I'm just doing my effing job. She said I was actually really polite when we met years later, and I don't remember it that way, but I'm glad she remembers it that way. And then I decided to move on further down the block, and then again there was this massive rumble and explosion, and that was the second tower that was coming down. And actually, just moments before that, I'd called my apartment. I had another friend of mine staying there, and as I approached, it was one of the payphones. There was a guy standing at the payphone in all the dust, and he said, I can't get through. And I said, I can't get through on my mobile. And he said, here's a quarter. Maybe you can get through. And so I got through to Joanna, who was at the apartment, and I said, hey, Joanna, it's Jason, I'm down here. And she said, I said, I'm fine. And next minute, that was when the second tower came down. I literally dropped the receiver and started sprinting. So she remembers being on the other end of the phone, and just hearing the silence. And at that point, I got to Fulton Street subway station. I went down the stairs into that, and I ended up being with the ticket clerk in the office, and there was an FBI agent down there as well, and then we were discussing what we were going to do at that point, and we sort of also discussed the idea of actually going down the tunnels and getting out of there that way. It's still, I think the thing was, when something like that happens on your doorstep, it's so different from when you go to somewhere, you go and document this is happening to someone else. I was documenting it, but it was also happening to me at the same time as well, and to my friends. We were all, obviously completely shell-shocked by what had happened. Every morning I'd come out. I live on Waverley and 6th Avenue, and I'd come out onto the street, and the Twin Towers were right there. And often we'd sort of gauge the weather by whether you could see the tops of the towers or not. And after that, you get up, and it's such a shocking thing. It's almost incomprehensible to think that those buildings are not there. You'd look down there, and there was just big empty space. And I think it's a place that we all had if you'd been to New York, even if you hadn't been to New York, there's such iconic structures. And whether they're structures, you see them as sort of something that's very arrogant, or you see them as something of beauty, or just as a landmark, or whatever, or a feat of human endeavor. It's still just the audacity of what happened there is just so shocking. And even to this day, I get quite choked up about it still. There's certain moments that happen, and it really, it penetrates me. Like the court officer who I mentioned, I reconnected with her a few years ago, and it was very emotional to sort of come back and retell. And her story was quite phenomenal, because she had actually been in the South Tower when it collapsed. So just after I'd seen her, when I'd photographed her when she was helping this other officer, she had actually just got out of the rubble. Her commanding officer that she was with was killed next to her. They got thrown, and she miraculously survived without really any injuries. But her commanding officer was killed down there.
Jason Florio recalling his story from 9/11 and the pictures that he made that day. I was researching some further facts from the day, and I found this story about a photojournalist called William Bigart. He'd been tipped off by a cab driver who told him about the unfolding disaster at the World Trade Center. And William, like Jason, grabbed his cameras, and there were three, two of which were film, and one of which was a very, very early digital camera, a $3,000 3.1 megapixel prosumer D30, which had just been released in 2000. And it's an important part of the story, that camera being a digital one. He decided when he got to the scene to follow firefighters, and he posted himself near the burning South Tower. When that building collapsed, he ran, and according to the archive memorial site, was completely swallowed by the dust cloud that resulted. when he emerged, he documented others who had suffered the same fate, and they were choking and clearing their lungs from the dust from the collapsed tower. And according to a dedicated website, soon after the collapse, he spoke to his wife on the cell phone and told her he was safe. He said, "I'm with the firemen. I'm safe." And so he returned again to the heart of the disaster, and this time he stood below the North Tower, and he pointed his camera up at the single standing twin tower. About 29 minutes after the first tower fell, the second followed, but this time it sadly took William's life, and he was the only professional photographer to die on 9/11. His cameras, the 6 rolls of film and the compact flash card, they were all discovered, and they're now important historical artifacts of that fateful day. And the reason why I mentioned that the digital camera and card are so important in this story is that hardly any of the film photographs that he took that day survived, and it was the compact flash that delivered the last pictures that William made in his life and of that day as the tower fell. You know, when the towers did fall, only 20 people were pulled alive from the site. The final survivor, 27 hours after the North Tower's collapse. Now, I made a picture several years earlier myself when visiting New York City. This would have been sometime in the mid-90s. It was made from the South Tower observation deck. There was no observation deck on the North Tower. It was just the South. And I was looking back up Manhattan Island, long before I had any thoughts of becoming a photographer. And the picture was made with a camera that my dad had bought me for Christmas. It was my Nikon TW Zoom 105. It was a 35mm film camera. I still have that today. I was snapping away all weekend, or maybe sketchbooking, as I call it these days, of course, completely unaware of the path that lay ahead for me photographically. And I'll share the picture that I made. It was of 2 shadows cast by the Twin Towers up along Manhattan Island, which I thought looked reasonably creative as an idea. Maybe I was inspired by something I'd already seen. I can't quite remember. But looking back, and I found that picture earlier on. Yesterday I found it when I was formulating or editing some of the sound for this edition today, and those shadows now, of course, look exceptionally more ominous. In his pictures from the actual day, Jason mentioned the silence of those photographs, and that's an apt way really to transition to this next memory. This time some thoughts from Friday's guest from episode 398, another Englishman plying his trade photographically in New York, Phil Penman, a news photographer, now a street photographer, celebrated street photographer. Here's Phil on the sound of that day, but initially I asked him what his memories were in terms of what it felt like mentally.
Yeah, I think you're not really there.
No.
I rushed down there within 5 minutes of getting the phone call to get down there, raced down on my bicycle, and then, you just go into this autopilot. It wasn't until, I saw the people kind of walking towards me after the tower, like the tower had come down 1 block in front of me. Cool. So I'm taking a picture with like a 28 to 70 of the burning. And, no one knew what was going to happen, and all of a sudden it just came down right in front of me. People grabbed me, we all ran for it. Managed to get into like a music store that was behind, and I came out, and there was this moment where it's very overwhelming because you're not really taking it in. You're young. The only moment I had was like, well, can I take these pictures of these people? Because I've never done anything like this.
No.
You kind of had to snap out of it, and then you slowly become more comfortable, more confident what you're doing, and just autopilot, photographing as much as I could. And the next freak out was like someone screamed out, right, the second one's about to come down, ran into another building, and just all these sort of things you don't really think about. Like, someone gave me a mask and said, you should put this on because you know what, and I didn't even think about that. It's like, so if the buildings had come down any other way, I'd be dead. If I stayed down there too long, I'd probably have respiratory issues like many people have suffered. You know, it took me years before I could even talk about it, to be honest. And I see the pictures a lot. That helps. Talking to people like yourself, talking about it helps as well. And then, you know, the thing that gets me now is I'm slowly losing my friends that I photographed on that day. I think the worst mess I've been in a while was when George Slay, one of the guys I photographed, he passed away like a year or so ago, and his daughter sent me a message saying that he passed, and that really shook me. Probably more so than the day, because I don't know, you just become like, my thing was every year I would write to him every year on 9/11, and we would like check in on each other, see how we're both doing.
I remember Jason, one of my early conversations with Jason. I think it was a conversation recorded in Africa when I saw him in Africa, and the first thing we talked about wasn't the pictures, actually. It was the sound. He recounted the sound of the day, which he said, I can't lose the sound of the day.
Yeah, I believe that. It was very silent after the tower had come down. Like, you'd hear like the bleak sound of the siren, but it was just, everything was very calm. People weren't really, you'd hear like the odd scream here and then, but most people weren't speaking. You know, the only thing I remember was like, I had to run back from the site to offices, and that was a good 40 to 50 block. And I'm covered, and I've got this mask, and I've got my camera gear. I remember just running through Manhattan and people just staring at me, because it was like they hadn't been down there, that no one had seen what had happened yet. And then all of a sudden you just see someone who's covered running past you. And then I managed to rush my pictures out as quickly as I could to get it into the papers. And then, of course, all the Wi-Fi and everything went down, because the thing was on top of the building. The tower was on top of the building. So no one, I think my mum said that they knew I was down there because they saw me on TV. Like, I guess like the live shots saw me. But I didn't get to talk to my parents probably until the next morning, I think. So I just told, I had a friend in Rotterdam. She managed to get hold of me on the cell phone. She was the only person that managed to get through to me. And I just said, just do me a favor, call up my parents and let them know that I'm okay.
The voice of Phil Penman, whose pictures, just like Jason's, will be on the show page today. Now, Phil mentioned the late George Slay, who was on the 91st floor of the North Tower when the second plane hit. His 10 colleagues escaped with their lives that day. And what amazed me when I read his account, and I'll leave a note to George's story as well on the show page, what amazed me when I read his account, one in which he recalls the screaming engine noises and seeing wings disappear into the building, was that the aircraft struck just 2 floors above, between the 93rd and 99th floor. Instantly, the sprinklers sprung into action, and I don't know why this particularly occurred to me, but I was surprised to read that not one window from his recollections on that floor broke. As I say, the story will be on the show page today. But finally today, as we pay our respects to an event that has truly shaped our lives, travel, geopolitics, for generations to come, I'd like to play you words from an interview I did with the celebrated documentary and street photographer Joel Meyerowitz. He wanted to tell the story of New York City post-attacks, and in particular he wanted to tell the story of Ground Zero, but the area was declared, for obvious reasons, a crime scene, and so access was nigh on impossible for photojournalists and journalists alike. Joel decided he would find a way in, and I wondered how he managed, when others could get absolutely nowhere near, to tell what was and what is a vital archive story.
It's a kind of chutzpah. You know the expression chutzpah? It's a Yiddish expression. New Yorkers use it all the time. It's like having balls. You know, you want to do something, you got to have the balls to do it. You got to figure it out. You can't just say, oh, I want to do this, and you expect someone to come with a magic wand and tap you on the head. Say, okay, now you can do it. I had to figure out how I can get in there. A cop told me, no photographs, buddy. This is a crime scene. And when I heard that, and I argued with her, and I said, what about the press? And she pointed and said, there's the press. They're not going in either. I thought, if the press is not going in, there's not going to be a record. How could Giuliani, that fascist fucker, do that to the people of New York? And so I decided that's my job. I'm going to do that. I'm going to figure out how to get in there.
Yeah.
And so I worked, the streets. I started to think who I knew, what could I do, blah, blah. And finally I remembered, Adrian Benepe. He was the commissioner of Manhattan's parks, and his father was a good friend of mine, and his father had founded the Green Market system of New York. All the outdoor markets of New York were conceived of by his dad, who really made a great and effective offering to the people of New York. Just like I go to the green markets in London when I'm there. And so I called Adrian, who I knew since he was a little kid. He said, you're a straight arrow. I know you. I'll get you a Parks Department badge tomorrow. You go in, but we have nothing to do with you after you go in. You're on your own. So sure enough, he gave me the little badge, and I immediately scanned it and printed it out in all the colors because they were New York City and all of its stupidity. It printed the badges on construction paper that kids use in school, pink, blue, red, green, yellow, magenta. Yeah. They printed it on the cheapest paper you could find, available anywhere. I bought one. I bought a pack of paper, and I made my own badges. I went down there. This Smokey, a ranger, drove me in a little 3-wheeled vehicle. He dumped me in the middle of ground zero and said, good luck, bye. And there I was standing there with my view camera on my shoulder, my 35 millimeter bag of, holders for the film, rolls of film in my pocket. And I look around and I see everybody's wearing boots, hard hats, masks, gloves. And I thought, oh, shit, I better get a hard hat. And I see on a plywood wall that had been erected, I see a hard hat hanging. Nobody around. I go over, I pick up the hard hat.
Don't tell me you lifted it.
I lifted it and put it on my head. Right. And the thing about it was so great. On the front, it said NYPD. Oh. And on the back was an American flag. And I thought, got my first bit of equipment. Then I went over and I got myself a respirator and a pair of gloves. And there was a place where they were giving out boots, and I put on boots. And then I got, a reflecting vest. And within a few minutes, I looked like everybody else.
And then you spent 9 months there, didn't you? Best part of 9 months, I think. Thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs. I wonder whether you would. I mean, your work is. There's so many important facets to your work, and the books and the pictures and street work, but I wonder whether you might describe this as perhaps your most important work.
Yeah, I think in historical terms, it was one of those necessities that was being obliterated by Giuliani's resistance, and it required someone to go in and give up their life for whatever it took. Yeah. 9 months in this case, and to do it with a kind of discipline, get up. I was in 12 hours a day, sometimes 14 hours a day. I'd get up 7 o'clock in the morning. I'd be down there. By midnight, I would sometimes be, because they worked 24 hours a day.
Yes, they did, yeah.
There were 3 shifts that came in, so it was working round the clock. It was. And so I could be there through 2 shifts, sometimes into 3 shifts. My wife was willing to give me that kind of room to go and do that and not be available on a regular basis. And I just knew it was important, and there was no money to be made from it. I couldn't sell the pictures or publish them. During it, Giuliani had basically put a ban on it. I just built the archive, hoping that someday it would have resonance and value and be useful for historians. And that there'd be a museum to hold it and all of that. So it was a total gamble, and it cost me a lot of money to do it. I didn't work basically for 9 months. I didn't have a job. I'm not a rich guy. I had a studio. I put more people on in the studio. I had 7 people working for me in the studio so that they could process the work and put it into the database and make the files and, keep the organization of it going. I had to mortgage my house. I had to take a business loan. I did get some money at some point from a charity, from a foundation, but I couldn't take the money personally because I wasn't a legitimate recipient of these funds. I had to pass the funds through the Museum of the City of New York, and I never received that money. I mean, this was one of these outrageous interactions that just, you can't believe that it happened.
And my sincere thanks to all the contributors today, Joel Meyerowitz, Jason Florio, and Phil Penman. And you know me with my passion for quotes that encapsulate feeling, and it's not, of course, difficult to find many that would serve as a postscript to this walk today, to remember those that have been affected by the actions of a few that day. Whatever you feel politically, whomever you directly or indirectly blame, the unreserved feelings that you have that you keep quietly tucked away in corridors of the mind you're not quite sure are appropriate to publicly share. It's interesting, I think, that the messages that carry the most power, or perhaps the most courage in the face of the evil of that day, are the ones about peace. It feels somewhat flippant to carry a movie quote at this moment, but I happen to think that when Richard Curtis wrote these words from a romantic comedy, that he was very much onto something. He wrote them for the character David, played and voiced by the actor Hugh Grant, who said, I think it was at the start of the film, when the planes hit the Twin Towers, as far as I know, none of the phone calls from the people on board were messages of hate or revenge. They were all messages of love. On the 10th anniversary of the tragedy, Barack Obama said, even the smallest act of service, the simplest act of kindness, is a way to honor those we lost, a way to reclaim the spirit of unity that followed 9/11. And in the days following the attacks, our own late Queen Elizabeth II, said, grief is the price we pay for love. Let's walk again on Friday.